And this month, this talk here is Elementor Performance, why it really matters. So thanks for joining. Tonight's session is a little bit different. If you've followed my sessions for this year, they've had a little bit of a twist, a little bit more kind of conceptual. So this talk really isn't about caching plugins, CDNs, optimizing checklists, checking right perfect scores, things like that. It's more a discussion about the decisions that we make while we're actually building Elementor websites. Because one thing I've noticed over the years, let's make this full screen. And one thing I've noticed over the years is that a lot of performance problems are really architecture problems kind of in disguise. And the interesting thing is that many of these sites, they still look visually impressive on launch day, but you tend to find that problems usually appear later on as the site grows, if it gets more content added, clients start editing things, more plugins get introduced, that sort of stuff. So tonight, I want to step back from the individual optimization tricks and focus more on some kind of principles and guidelines. What actually matters now in Elementor and what tends to create cleaner, faster, and more maintainable websites overall. And more importantly, what matters less than it used to nowadays, because things are improving all the time. Some of the biggest performance gains that I've seen recently didn't really come from advanced optimization at all. It came from simplification. So hopefully tonight gives you a few useful ways to think differently about performance while building, not just after launch and optimizing everything page by page. It's all right. Let's jump in. So you hand over a website and everything looks great. The layouts are clean, responsive behavior is working properly, performance scores are solid in the green, and then the client logs in. Now, they make what feels like a normal change. Maybe they update some headings, they swap images out, maybe paste in text from Word, and suddenly something kind of shifts. Spacing breaks, section wraps awkwardly, the mobile layout looks a bit weird, or a carefully balanced row suddenly becomes uneven. And usually the client has no idea that they've done something risky, because from their perspective, they're just content editing, right? And honestly, most of the time, they're right. They're interacting with the interface in the way that it was designed to be used. So this talk really isn't about bad clients. It's about recognizing something important. If a layout is fragile enough that normal editing can break, and the problem probably started during the build process. And that's the mind shift I want to explore tonight, the build process. Because performance problems and maintainability problems, they're often really connected and related. The more complex, over-engineered, unpredictable a build becomes, the easier it's to accidentally damage later on. So the goal isn't to stop clients editing, no. It's to build Elementor sites that survive the editing process. So a few years ago, when people talked about Elementor performance, the conversation was often very black and white. Elementor is bloated, Elementor is slow, page builders can't perform well. And honestly, some of those claims were probably fair at the time, especially back in the older kind of sections and columns era. But Elementor in 2026 is a very, very different product. In fact, it's just got a significant overhaul again with Editor version 4, which I will cover in a few months' time, once I've had a good play around with it. But version 3 introduced containers, which significantly reduced the DOM complexity, the underlying HTML widgets and elements underneath. They got a real makeover. The CSS loading is much, much smarter. Asset handling is better. Flexbox and grid layouts are far more efficient. And overall, the platform itself has matured a lot. So in many cases now, Elementor itself is no longer the main performance issue. It can be, but if you go with me through this talk, I'm saying Elementor is no longer like the main thing that people can point a finger at to say, Elementor are slow, page builders are slow. What I see far more often is we overbuild. So too many nested containers, too many widgets, too many animations for sure, and too many one-off styling decisions, too many third-party add-ons, all trying to save tiny, tiny problems. Individually, none of these are that serious, but together they accumulate. So modern Elementor performance is less about can Elementor be fast and more about how disciplined are we while building in Elementor. Because you can absolutely build very fast Elementor websites right now, but you usually get there through restraint and consistency, not through clever optimization tricks afterwards. And I think that's actually pretty good news for us as designers and developers, because it means performance is very much under our control as the builders, as the architects. I had a thought question, if you want to put your thoughts in the chat. Do you think Elementor still deserves its old reputation for being slow? Or would you agree with me that it's been mostly optimized just now? One thing I think has changed quite a bit over the last few years is how we define a fast website. For a long time, performance conversations were dominated by scores. People chasing that 100 at 100 in Lighthouse, that green tick, trying to shave off tiny milliseconds, obsessing over page speed numbers and Google Core Web Vitals. And those tools are still useful, but they're not the full picture anymore, I think, because real world performance is about experience, not just numbers. So does the site feel smooth? Does it respond quickly? Does it jump around while loading? Does it feel stable on mobile? And does the editor feel usable 6 months later after the website has grown? Those things matter too, as much as speed. And I'd argue that perceived performance is often more important than technical perfection. A site can be technically load quickly, but still feel heavy and frustrating to use, especially when things like animations delay the interaction, layouts shift unexpectedly, oversized hero sections dominate the screen, or mobile users are waiting for unnecessary assets to load, particularly on slow connections. And another thing that people don't always think about is editor performance. If Elementor itself becomes slow and painful to work with because it's trying to load in too much stuff, that's also a performance problem. And I've never seen anyone really do an audit on the Elementor editor itself. It's always on the homepage or the contact page or the product page. Because eventually, if the editor's slow as well, that's going to affect content updates, workflow efficiency, client confidence, long-term maintainability, things like that. So when I think about performance, now I'm thinking more holistically. I'm not thinking in terms of fast homepage, fast product page. I'm thinking about interacting with the whole WordPress website as a client would. Steve says he's famous for being a huge critic of the big E, even though it's been your tool of choice. I know, there's lots of fingers pointing at it. And that's what happens when you get a majority. WordPress has a lot of fingers pointing at it because it powers 43% of the web, and Elementor is now biggest page builder, so it gets fingers points. And some of those criticisms are well deserved, and some of them, have been addressed, and that's good. That's the way that things should be. So I think having a think about performance as an overall holistic approach to everything, I think that's a much more useful mindset for modern Elementor builds. One of the biggest performance issues I see in Elementor builds is complexity that slowly accumulates over time. And the tricky part is it often starts with good intentions. So you're building a layout, you add a container to help position something, then another for alignment, then another for spacing, and maybe a wrapper for responsive behavior. And before long, you've got deeply nested structures that technically work, but are becoming fragile underneath. And this might not be you when you're designing the system from scratch because you're thinking about performance, you're building it, but it's definitely true when you've inherited an Elementor website that's been under a client control for 2-3 years. They're not building, they don't understand design systems. They're just making things work. And it can get very complicated very quickly when they try and do something, especially in the responsive area. Now, visually, that page might look great, but complexity creates hidden costs. More containers mean more DOM elements, more CSS relationships, more layout calculations, more things that can behave unpredictably later on. And that also increases cognitive load. So the way that we approach it, if you want to edit a page that's so complicated, your brain just doesn't want to go there. And that's a problem as well. Because 6 months later, someone has to understand how that whole structure works. And that may be the client, it may be a new person moving into that position, maybe it's another developer, maybe it's future you at 11 p.m. trying to fix something really quickly. And this is where performance and maintainability kind of overlap quite heavily. Complex layouts tend to break more easily, become very harder to edit, scale poorly, and require a lot more ongoing effort, especially once content changes start happening. When you hand over that system to the client and they start editing and changing things. A slightly longer heading, a different image ratio, extra line of text, suddenly the whole layout starts behaving completely differently. So one of the most underrated performance strategies now is simply reducing unnecessary complexity very early on. Because flatter, simpler layouts, they tend to be faster and easier to maintain. Containers should be boring. Now, that might sound a little strange in a creative industry, but boring containers structures are usually a very, very good sign. When people first move into containers, there's often a temptation to be very clever with layouts because they're super flexible. Lots of nested directions, complex response behavior, containers inside containers inside containers, or nested is the Elementor term for that. But an Elementor gives us a huge amount of flexibility to do that, but flexibility itself can become instability. Because the more complicated a structure becomes, the harder it is to predict how it's going to behave later on, especially once real content gets added to it. So again, longer headings, different images, different ratios, additional buttons, translated content, mobile stacking behavior, that sort of stuff adds to complexity. So simple layouts handle change much, much better than the complex ones. And honestly, most professional websites don't actually need complicated structures. A lot of high-performing websites are built from very consistent spacing, predictable layouts, reusable section patterns, and relatively flat structures. If you go on to some of the top websites like Nikon, Sony, Apple, if you really just have a look at their pages, they're pretty simple. They're not fancy, they're not doing fancy stuff, they're not got a lot of nested stuff, they're lots of white space, very simple. Here's the presentation, here's the content. So one practical habit I developed is if I need to stop and mentally explain how a website section or area works, that's usually a big warning sign for me. It's overly complex. It probably means that the structure is being far too clever. Because ideally, that should feel pretty obvious to yourself, to your future self, to the clients who come in and edit it. Easy to scan, easy to edit, easy to maintain. So when I say containers should be boring, I really mean they should be predictable. So predictable layouts are usually faster and they survive real-world editing much, much better over time. One of the easiest ways Elementor sites become heavy, slow, unperformant is through widget accumulation. Because widgets don't just add content. Most of them also add CSS, JavaScript, layout logic, interactions, sometimes third-party dependencies, all that good stuff to make them work. Now, eventually, that often doesn't seem like a big deal. A slider here, an accordion there, maybe some tabs, a carousel, a pop-up, a fancy animated counter. And in their own, they're usually fine. But performance problems often are cumulative. Because once those decisions start repeating across the website, the weight multiplies very, very quickly, especially on larger builds. And I'm not talking about just adding lots of widgets to a single page. I'm talking about using lots of widgets in different areas of the website. Because if you've got 100 people on 100 different pages and they've all got widgets on them, that's a performance hit to the server. Now, do a marketing campaign and scale up to 1,000 users, the server's not going to be a happy person. So I think this is one of the hidden traps for most modern builders, not just Elementor. The interface makes everything feel really light. Just drag another widget, done. But under the surface, every widget is introducing behavior, and behavior has a cost. Now, that doesn't mean never use widgets or never use advanced widgets. That's not very realistic. And we're all about, being realistic about these things. Sometimes a carousel or an interactive element generally does improve experience. The key is intentionality. So choosing widgets because they solve a problem, not just because they look impressive and they're there to use. And honestly, some of the fastest Elementor sites that I've seen are also the simplest. Heading, text, image, button, good spacing, clear hierarchy. That combination still works incredibly well. So one practical mind shift is, instead of asking, what widget could I use here? Ask, what's the simplest possible way to achieve this outcome? That question alone just leads to better performance decisions overall across the entire website. So one of the things that catches people out with Elementor Performance is repetition. And I alluded to this in the last slide there. Because a single design decision might seem completely harmless on its own, or one animated widget, one carousel, one fancy testimonial slider, one Lottie animation, no big deal. But websites are systems, and systems repeat patterns. So the real question is not how expensive is this widget once. The real question is what happens when this appears 20 times across the website, 100 times, 1,000 times. That one widget, that one testimonial widget on your homepage, if you run a marketing ad on TV or radio and you get hit by 10,000 people, that could be what makes or breaks the website. It's scale. And that's where the performance starts to shift. Because repeated widgets multiply JavaScript execution, rendering work, animation processing, image loading, layout calculations, all that stuff. And sometimes the impact isn't immediate or obvious during development. A homepage with a few heavy sections might still be acceptable on a fast desktop connection when you're running it solo through GT metrics. But once that site grows, more pages get added, more editors contribute, more content accumulates, more mobile users become the majority, more people are visiting the website, that weight compounds very, very quickly. And this applies to styling decisions too. Repeated shadows, repeated animations, repeated custom CSS, repeated icon libraries, all that sort of stuff. Individually, they feel tiny, but collectively, they become the site's personality from a performance perspective. And that's why reusable systems matter so much, not just for design consistency, but because they force a bit of restraint. So if every new section becomes a brand new experiment, the site gradually is going to become heavier and less predictable. Whereas repeated intentional patterns tend to scale much more cleanly because you've thought about it holistically. So one thing I try to ask during builds now is, if this decision gets repeated across the entire site at scale, would I still be comfortable using it? That question catches a lot of future performance problems very, very easy. Okay, now performance talk would not be a performance talk without talking about images. So if I had to pick one area where Elementor sites still lose the most performance in 2026, it would probably still be images. Not CSS, not containers, not even JavaScript most of the time, but images. Yep, Duncan WebP, all for images. Because images are usually the heaviest elements in a website, especially extremely visual websites, which tend to be the norm now. Large hero sections, full width banners, background photography, layered imagery. decorative textures, high resolution marketing visuals, all that kind of good stuff. It all adds up very, very quickly. Now, the good news is modern formats like WebP and AVIF, I don't know how that pronounced, AVIF, I think it's AVIF, have helped a lot. Yes, Steve. Elementor does have good image optimization, but yeah, we're thinking long term, big systems. Now, browsers are smarter as well. Compression is better. Responsive image handling is better, but discipline still matters more than technology, I think. Because I still regularly see massive uploads directly from Photoshop, oversized hero images, images displayed for far smaller than their actual dimensions, far, far smaller. Transparent PNGs being used unnecessarily, all that sort of stuff. And what's important to understand is that images affect more than just load speed. They also affect the layout stability, perceived responsiveness, mobile usability, and often visual overwhelm. So a site can technically load quickly, but still feel heavy because the visual density is just far too high. It's in your face. And this is where performance overlaps with design maturity. Good visual hierarchy usually performs a lot better when we sit back and we think about how we're using those visual components in pages rather than just put them on the page and use them. Intentional imagery performs much, much better. Clear content focus performs much better. So rather than asking how many images can I add, I think the better question to ask is which images generally improve the understanding, trust, and usability of this page. Because images should support the content, not compete with it. And honestly, some of the more professional websites feel restrained visually, and it gives the content room to breathe. That kind of restraint often improves performance just automatically, just by making these decisions about what to represent rather than just representing it and seeing what happens then. AVIF is still not Google friendly. It's new. It's kind of supported by most of the browsers out there. But yes, it's a new format. WebP isn't new, by the way. It's like 20x years old, but it's just starting to be embraced. So AVIF has no chance in this decade. Okay, last bit about images before we'll jump into a little case study. Background images versus actual images. This is a real thing. So this is one of those small build decisions that quietly affects performance, responsiveness, and accessibility all at once. I think a lot of Elementor users fall into using background images for almost everything because visually it feels easier. You drop a container in, set a background image, add an overlay, add positioning, maybe some text, and done. And sometimes that feels absolutely the right choice. Sometimes it is the right choice, especially for things like decorative sections, atmospheric visuals, abstract branding, large hero treatments, that sort of stuff. But the problem begins when important content images are treated as backgrounds instead of actual image elements, because background images behaves very differently. Browsers treat them differently. Responsive handling is different. Accessibility is different. Loading behavior is different. So for example, background images are not inherently meaningful content. They don't have an alt text. They are harder to optimize responsively. And they encourage using oversized images because it's a background, right? You want it big. Whereas actual image elements are much more flexible and semantic. They scale more predictably within the content. They support responsive imaging handling a lot better for things like source set. They have improved accessibility because of the alt tag. And they usually give you more control over the performance behavior when you optimize them. Another issue is that background image heavy designs can become extremely difficult to manage responsively because they're changing with the container. So now you've got to think not only about the image resizing, you've also got to think about the container and how the container affects the image. And yeah, it gets complex. So you end up spending time fighting cropping, focal points, text readability, mobile scaling, awkward stacking behavior, that sort of stuff. So a useful rule of thumb is this. If the image is meaningful to the content, it should probably be an actual image element. If the image is purely decorative or atmospheric, a background image can make sense. That single distinction improves the surprising number of Elementor layouts and your performance as well. Okay, so that's been a lot of blah, blah, blah from me. Let's do a quick example. Now, I recently audited a charity website that was struggling with performance, especially on mobile. Now, visually, the site looked fairly polished at first glance. It looked professionally done. But once I started digging into the actual assets being loaded, the problem became very obvious very quickly. Now, most of the images across the site had been uploaded directly from smartphones or stock images that had been downloaded at super high res. So we're talking about 3,000, 5,000 pixel plus images, large PNG files, oversized uploads being displayed about 600 pixels wide with the actual layout. So you've got this 3,000 pixel monster just being used as like a little content sidebar in pages and call to actions and landing pages. And this was happening everywhere: blog posts, content pages, call to action hero sections, reusable layouts, all that sort of stuff, all the good stuff. Now, the interesting part was the reasoning behind it. The client said that their previous designer had recommended always using full high-res versions so the site would look sharp on Apple Retina displays. And technically, there's a bit of truth in that. But when we checked the Google Analytics, the reality looked very different. Not SEO friendly, no. I looked at screen resolution and device model data within GA4. Most visitors were on mobile devices, so that's good. But only a relatively small percentage were using that high density Retina displays, where that level of image fidelity would even be noticeable. So the site was carrying a huge visual weight for a use case that affected only a tiny minority of users. So what we ended up doing was much more intentional. We had looked through all the pages of the website, the one like the top, I was going to say top 100, and it was because they had a lot of pages. Top 100 pages, identified which ones needed to remain very sharp, very crystal clear. So things like images containing small text, diagrams, maybe some visuals where detail actually mattered. So those ones, they stayed at higher quality. And we actually used the AVIF format, but it was a lot smaller, 3,000 pixels wide, I can tell you. But the majority of the decorative and content imagery, we resized them completely appropriately. We compressed them, we converted them to WebP, and actually we found another major performance issue. The previous agency designer had used large, full-width background images in many containers, but they'd use these containers for like in hero images, in call to actions, and sales pages, and landing pages from adverts. So they were mainly container background image, 75, 80% black overlay, so you could see the white text on the front. Okay. Which meant that they were downloading huge high-resolution images, again, 5,000, 3,000 pixels wide, but the images were barely even seen under the dark overlay. So we aggressively optimized those background images as well. Visually, nothing changed. You could see that there was an image behind it, but because of the overlay, you can't really see any details, so that didn't matter. So almost nothing changed visually. The site looked pretty much identical afterwards. But in some cases, page sizes actually dropped by about 90%, actual kilobytes. That we're down to from megabytes to kilobytes. So when I showed the client the numbers, their jaw nearly dropped the floor. The main key stakeholder, she actually said, well, wait a minute, this is on Zoom. And she went into her boss's office and showed what the website was doing on her mobile phone. And they were all very, very happy for that. So performance dramatically improved, especially on mobile. That was good. And I think there's a really important lesson with Elementor Performance. A lot of optimization is not about making sites look worse. You want to keep it the same. It's about being intentional about where visual fidelity actually matters in the user experience. Yes, if you've got a big area and you need a big background, that's fine. But if you're putting a 70, 80% black overlay, you're not going to see any fidelity. So you don't need that image as high quality. Because often we're loading far more weight than users can realistically perceive with their eyes or benefit from. So that was a huge option. That was a huge task that we did that. But the performance gain that we got overall, oh man, they were so happy with that. And that had a ripple on effect to SEO and ads as well. Because when the people were going from the ads into the landing page, it takes so long to load that they were just out of there. So they saw an increase not only of site performance, but also conversions and SEO and everything that rippled on. So that was a good case study. That was a good one. Okay, let's jump into the other stuff. Fonts. I'm not going to speak too much about fonts. They do quietly add weight. Fonts are one of those performance costs that often go a bit unnoticed individually. It doesn't feel very dramatic, but again, they accumulate a lot over time across the entire site, especially if you're using slightly different fonts for different landing pages. Again, the previous case study that I told, they were using about 8 or 9 different fonts. But not only that, the way that the fonts have been loaded in, they weren't using dynamic fonts. They had all the TTS or OTS or what it is they have just now, but they had 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, bold and italic, all these things that they didn't use at all. So there was like half a dozen files being loaded in for one font and then 8 different fonts, and it just didn't make sense. So I think this happens a lot in Elementor because typography controls are so accessible. It's easy for people to load and stuff. And it's very easy to add another weight, try another font pairing. But really, each font weight family can introduce all these additional files. Really, I think just when you're dealing with fonts, keep it practical. Avoid adding too many weights. Limit your icon fonts. Ensure you're loading those fonts locally. Just use a bit of restraint, I think. There we go. Styling. So one of the easiest ways Elementor sites gradually become heavy is through accumulated styling decisions. And what makes this tricky is that none of these decisions feel dangerous at the time. So you're adding padding slightly for one section, you're adding custom border radius somewhere else, using a slightly different shadow, tweaking spacing for mobile, introducing another button variation. And individually, that feels okay and harmless, but over time, these little variations start multiplying across the site. They get added on a page by page. Elementor adds them to a CSS file. The CSS file grows, and therefore, your page can slow down a little bit. So eventually you're ending up with inconsistent spacing systems, duplicate styling, more CSS output, as I said. The version 4 editor helps with that, with being a CSS first approach. So the idea is that you define CSS once for a behavior, and then you're not having to go in each individual page and element and apply a radius, a padding, a color, that sort of stuff. So especially in Elementor, it's very easy to customize every single widget independently. I think it's moved to the version 4 editor, and this new concept is really, really going to help for these things. And it applies across everything: colors, border styles, shadows, button treatments, typography scales, responsive spacing, all that sort of stuff. So consistency, I think, creates efficiency for that. If you can reduce CSS, then you're increasing performance. Global styles. People think global styles mainly is a kind of branding and workflow feature. Color, typography, buttons, spacing. Yes, they absolutely help with consistency, but it's also a performance tool. Because the moment styling decisions move from a shared system, you start introducing duplication across the site. So instead of redefining the style section by section, you should really be reusing the same decisions that you've made in global styling performance. Again, the version 4 editor puts that on its head with styling first, which is great. But if you don't want to move or can't move to version 4 just now, then please rely on your global styles. It's cleaner CSS, it's cleaner design logic. It's much easier to maintain builds going forward if you're just going to the one place to edit and change stuff. It also changes how you kind of think about web building. You stop asking, what styling should I apply here to this button container, and start asking, which existing systems should I use? What consistency do I need across different branding and different pages? That shift alone reduces a huge amount of unnecessary complexity and increases performance. It becomes even more valuable as sites grow and scale, because once multiple editors or developers are involved, inconsistency spreads very quickly without a shared system or a global system to jump back on. So global styles, they help create predictable spacing, cleaner responsive behavior, easier updates, fewer overrides, less CSS, better performance. So those decisions, they compound over time. So for me, global styles are really about building a calmer, boring systems, but they do scale a lot cleaner. And we're not talking about websites here with 5 to 10 pages. We're talking like fairly decent client websites that have got thousands of pages on it. That's when the performance really starts to hit the fan. Motion, let's talk about motion. This slide alone just makes me sick. Blech. Motion is one of those areas where modern websites can become heavy very, very quickly because Elementor makes animation and interaction really accessible, really easily. The interface does a good job on that. It allows for entrance animations, scroll effects, parallax, hover, interaction, sticky effects, looping animations, lottie animations. Now, there's a lot of animation going on there. And visually, these can absolutely add polish and personality, but when used carefully. But motion is not free. Every animated element introduces additional rendering for the browser. It's more work for the browser to do, especially once multiple effects start stacking together across pages. And what often happens is that animation gets added incrementally. One subtle fade here, a floating effect there, maybe moving the background, hover transition on cards. Individually, each effect, lightweight, but collectively again, they can create sluggish scrolling, mobile, delayed interactions, layout instability, pages that are just simply feel too heavy and make your eyes bleed. Particularly on lower powered devices as well. If you've got like a poor mobile on one of these, if you're out the stick somewhere, you've only got 2 bars, and now you've got an animation heavy website, performance is just going to go down the drain. I think this is where design maturity becomes important for us developers and designers, because animation should support the user experience, but not constantly compete for attention. One thing I've noticed on very polished websites, again, is that motion is usually restrained and intentional. So it's that little button shake when a page opens. It's the slight raised hover when you're hovering over something. Now that draws attention strategically. It guides the eye, it supports hierarchy, it reinforces interaction. Whereas over-animated websites often feel noisy and pretty exhausting after a few seconds, especially on your eyes. Another thing to consider is that animation completely scales with repetition. So a single animated section may perform particularly well, but if every section animates independently, as your user scrolls, cumulative costs becomes very significant. And again, scale. If you've got an animation on your homepage or an ad landing page, you run some sort of campaign, you're getting 1,000, 10,000 eyes on that. The server's not going to be very happy about that. So one useful question during builds is, if this animation disappeared, would the experience be meaningfully worse? Most times, probably not. Because sometimes the fastest and most professional feeling interface is just a simple CAM one. Mobile, we're getting towards the end now. So one thing I think desktop builders sometimes forget is most people are experiencing Elementor websites on mobile first. Now, I know responsive design has been a big thing, but I still see a lot of developer designers doing desktop first. It's still a big thing. So most people experiencing it on mobile first. Just think about that. Not on a huge desktop monitor with a fast internet and a powerful CPU. And mobile is usually where performance problems are become much more obvious because mobile devices have less processing power, less screen space, more variable network conditions, less tolerance for heavy layouts. Now, visually, a site might look fantastic on the desktop, but once that same layout starts stacking on mobile, it becomes all sorts of issues. Oversized spacing, massive hero sections, long scrolling experiences, awkward container stacking, animations that are triggering constantly, and images that dominate the screen, large images as well. And suddenly the website starts to feel much heavier than it did during development. I also think Elementor can sometimes not encourage desktop first thinking, because that's where we kind of visually build from. The Elementor editor is not optimized for mobile. It's not optimized for tablets when you're creating content. So you're already in the desktop environment. It feels more natural just to first build on that and then squeeze it down. But mobile layouts, they often need very intentional design decisions, not just responsive adjustments afterwards, especially in things like spacing, section density, image use, typography scaling, that sort of stuff. So another thing I've noticed is that mobile performance issues are usually cumulative as well. One slightly oversized section is usually fine, but if you repeat that across the entire page, that experience gradually becomes very tiring and very slow. So this is where restraint, again, matters. Cleaner mobile layouts feel a lot faster, even before technical optimization happens. So less movement, less clutter, less visual stuff, distraction. So one practical mind shift is this. Don't think of mobile as a smaller version of the desktop design. Think of it as its own experience, its own performance constraints. Because if Elementor site feels calm and efficient on mobile, it's usually going to feel pretty good elsewhere too. Third-party add-ons. This one's probably one of the more sensitive topics in the Elementor ecosystems because third-party add-ons, plugins, can be incredibly useful. Some solve real problems, some add generally valuable widgets, and some can dramatically speed up the development workflows. So this is definitely not an anti-add-on talk, but I do think it's important to recognize that every plugin, every add-on introduces additional complexity to the system, to the website. More widgets, more CSS, more JavaScript, more update dependencies, more compatibility considerations. And often, multiple add-on packs usually overlap quite heavily in functionality as well. So you may end up with 3 different carousel systems, multiple pop-up approaches, different styling, inconsistent widget behavior, that sort of stuff. Now, individually, each add-on may be perfectly reasonable, but once again, all combined together, performance, maintainability, risk increases very quickly, especially in the long term. Because performance is not just about the initial speed, it's also about update stability, debugging complexity, future compatibility, editor consistency. Anything that slows that down performance-wise, you're going to fall into issues with user experience and also the editors, the clients editing the stuff as well. Another issue is that add-on ecosystems sometimes encourage feature-driven building rather than systems-driven building. So you start designing around what cool widgets can I use there instead of what's the simplest and most maintainable solution I can produce. And again, over time, it creates a very fragmented build and increases or decreases the performance of the page speed as well. Now, so for me, the important question here is, are add-ons bad? It's not necessarily add-ons are bad. It's, does this add-on justify the complexity that it introduces? Sometimes it actually does, but every add-on should earn its place, I think, in your stack and not just added there just because one widget was there or needed. So here's another example. I inherited a research organization's Elementor site recently that looked reasonably normal on the surface again. They always do. But once you open the back end, it became clear that the site had evolved through years of incremental decisions, different clients changing over, different responsibilities, different developers, different experiments, different quick fixes. I'm sure you've all been there for a quick fix, just add another plugin, problem goes away, site performance lags. But over time, that whole stack that they've been using, all the plugins and all the different page layouts and stuff, have become incredibly fragmented and different. The site was running multiple Elementor add-on packs, so multiple plugins, overlapping widget systems, several animation plugins, including GSAP, that we couldn't really figure out where that was being used, but it was being loaded in anyway, multiple pop-up systems, and different styling frameworks all at once. So the interesting thing was that most of them were only being used for one or two small features on one or two pages. So you had one plugin existed purely because it provided a testimonial slider. So this was an Elementor add-on plugin, but they weren't using 99%. It's just using that one slider because the slider worked in a particular way on the mobile device with your finger that the other ones didn't. That was the reason behind that one. Another one, animated heading effect. So it had a particular animation that some person in the company at some point thought was cool. So they were using that, and that was it. That was the only widget for that entire 20, 30 widget pack that they were using. The thing that got me, though, was pop-up. So they were using another one for pop-up. Now, Elementor's got native pop-ups, but that wasn't being used. So that pop-up appeared just on one page, and that page was the contact page. You don't put pop-ups on contact pages. Boom. So individually, none of these decisions felt completely unreasonable, except for the pop-up on the contact page. That was crazy. But collectively, again, they had what created duplicate CSS, duplicate JavaScript, inconsistent behavior, editor slowdowns, a lot of front-end weight. I mean, some of their landing pages from their ads was just so slow because it's loading in 5 or 6 widgets that it was just unusable, basically. The site had effectively become a collection of layered decisions rather than somebody sat down and thought about it coherently as a system. And that happens after years. Different people, different ideas, different concepts. It builds and builds and builds and builds until it falls down performance-wise. Now, this client, they didn't have a full budget for a full rebuild. So instead, we aggressively optimized the site. We focused on simplifying it. So rather than do CDNs or all that sort of stuff, we actually sat down and thought, well, what do these pages need? How can we simplify the top, again, 50, 100 pages that we're doing? So we removed overlap. We standardized the widget set. We got rid of unnecessary add-ons. We consolidated the functionality at the back end. We replaced some effects that were being used to other plugins with native Elementor approaches, because nobody really knew that Elementor did that sort of stuff anymore, or from now. We discovered many pages that had been automatically converted from sections to containers when they moved from version 2 to version 3, but containers remained as redundant, nested underneath. So automatic conversion, yes, but you had containers within containers within containers. So we dealt with all that. And interestingly, the performance improved almost automatically as soon as that complexity was reduced. The server didn't have to work as hard. The browser didn't have to work as hard. Pages were delivered really, really, really quickly. And not because of one magical optimization trick, not because the system itself became, but because the system itself became cleaner and more intentional. And I think that's probably an important mind shift with Elementor Performance. A lot of optimization work is really just simplification work in disguise. Okay, so we've talked about what things matter in performance in 2026. Some things matter less than they used to now, so conversely. So one thing I think in healthy, modern performance discussions is recognizing that some older optimization techniques and advice matters less than it used to. Not because performance has stopped mattering, but because the web ecosystem has evolved. Browsers are smarter, hosting is better, caching is better, compression is better, CDNs are more common, and Elementor itself has significantly more efficient than it used to be. So some of the old performance decisions, some of the old performance advice just don't deserve the same amount of energy anymore, in my opinion. So things like obsessing about plugin counts Many plugins dynamically load resources now, so it's not as huge an issue. Chasing the perfect lighthouse or web core vital scores, for me, green is good enough rather than 100%. Micro-optimizing tiny CSS savings. So we're talking about people who are minifying 500 kilobyte files, unnecessary. Or trying to eliminate every single request at all costs. So that's just kind of effort versus reward, really. Good enough is my mantra now. Those things can still matter in certain situations or for certain pages. But for most Elementor sites today, I think the bigger outcome is usually from simpler layouts, cleaner systems, better image decisions, restrained motion, and more intentional design choices. So I've seen sites with relatively high plugin counts perform perfectly well because the overall system was clean. I've seen lightweight sites perform terribly because the design and structure were absolutely chaotic. So context matters a lot when you're designing Elementor systems. So fast enough, good enough is my mantra at the moment, because performance optimization can become a form of perfectionism. If we're not careful, we can spend too much time at the really small things. Again, you're going to go for the 20-80% rule. If you notice that people are uploading, the clients are uploading 5,000 pixel wide images, that's probably the best place to start to get the most performance of those. So focus first on structural decisions, and then create a broad improvement, and then optimize strategically where it generally affects user experience. When people hear the phrase design systems, they tend to imagine some huge enterprise products, massive documentation, but at a practical level, a design system is really just consistency applied intentionally. So consistent spacing, consistent typography, consistent layouts, that sort of stuff. The moment every section or container becomes a custom exercise, that's where the site starts accumulating performance issues with CSS and overrides generating more stuff. Whereas systems encourage reuse, if you're designing a system rather than just a website or a web page, you start repeating patterns, spatial logic, button styles, all that sort of stuff, rather than tweaking them all individually. So I think having a design system is good. Without systems, drift happens really quickly. So for me, design systems are not just about making sites look good. They're also one of the most effective ways to build Elementor sites, so they're fast, scalable, and maintainable long after launch. One of the biggest mind shifts I've seen over the years is realizing that we're usually not building websites just for launch day. We're building them for whoever has to work with them afterwards, whether that's future developers or the clients that we give them to. And that feature editor might not be technical, they might not be design aware, they might not be performance conscious or even familiar with Elementor. It might be a client, marketing team, an admin assistant, another developer, feature you 6 months later, trying to make changes quickly. And I think this is where a lot of Elementor performance and maintainability problems start, because during development, we often optimize or creative freedom or the speed of building. But after handover, those same decisions don't really matter anymore, at least not for the people who are using them and don't understand what the design system is. So especially if the layouts are complex, the styling is inconsistent, widgets behave unpredictability, every page works slightly differently. The feature editor, the person who's using it, and has to navigate all that complexity. And the harder a website is to understand, the more likely it is to break, drift visually, accumulate performance problems. That's why I think maintainability is actually part of performance, because a site that becomes difficult to safely edit eventually degrades operationally as well. So now when I'm building Elementor sites, I try to think ahead constantly. Questions like, would someone else understand the structure quickly? Is this section predictable? Can it scale cleanly? Will editing this feel safe in 6-8 months' time? And often the best performance decisions are the ones that reduce that future confusion. Cleaner systems, simpler layouts, predictable components, intentional restrictions. Those things, I think, make a website survive much better after launch and reduce the complexity and increase the performance. Because ultimately, professional builds are not just sites that look good initially, they're sites that continue behaving well once real people start using them. So before I wrap up, I know it's been a long talk, a bit longer than usual. I wanted to leave you with a very simple mental checklist about how to use Elementor builds. Not technical audits, not performance tools, just some practical questions during the actual build process. Because I think the biggest performance gains usually happen before optimization, traditional optimization, actually starts. So the first question is, can this be simpler? Do I really need that extra container, this animation, this widget, this layout variation? Or am I adding complexity that doesn't meaningfully improve the user experience, the outcome? The second question is, will this scale? Because a lot of decisions look fine once, they look fine on small, but websites tend to grow. More pages get added, more sections get duplicated, more editors get involved, more traffic accumulates. So try to think what happens if this pattern gets repeated 30 times, if there's 1,000 users, if there's 10,000 users. Third question is this reusable? Can this become a repeatable section, a standard layout, a part of a system, or a predictable editing pattern? Because reusable structures, they tend to remain much more stable over time. And the final question is probably the most important one for me right now, is would I want to edit this weekly? Because if something already feels confusing, fragile, overly clever, or difficult to navigate during development, it's probably going to become a future maintenance problem. And I think maintenance is part of performance. So therefore, it's going to be a performance issue down the line. So that single question catches me surprisingly number of bad decisions early on. And honestly, I think performance maturity is less about becoming obsessive with optimization tools, and it's more about building a calmer, cleaner, boring system, but predictable system from the start. Because most fast Elementor websites are not aggressively optimized, they're intentionally restrained. So one thing I've noticed after working on websites for a long time is the best performance websites usually feel nice and calm. They're not empty, they're not necessarily boring. They don't necessarily lack personality, but they're just intentional. They don't feel like they're constantly trying to impress you with jumping out stuff with movement, visual effects, layered interactions, endless design variations. Instead, they feel clear, stable, predictable, readable, easy to navigate, easy to use. And increasingly, those same qualities usually improve performance automatically, as we've seen in a couple of those case studies. Cleaner layouts tend to render more effectively, quicker. Consistent systems lead to less CSS complexity. Restrained motion tends to feel smoother. Simpler editing patterns tend to scale better over time and increased activity as well. So performance is not only a technical outcome, it's often a reflection of your designed maturity. And I think this is where Elementor actually has become very powerful in recent years, because the platform now gives us enough flexibility to build almost anything. But with that flexibility comes responsibility. I know it sounds a bit like a Yoda statement, but we as designers, we as developers, we need to decide what to add, what not to add, what to animate, what not to animate, what to customize, and where simplicity is actually a better professional choice rather than the complexity. So honestly, some of the most impressive Elementor sites I've seen recently are not the most visually complicated ones, the ones that feel focused, readable, maintainable, well considered. Site feels coherent. Editing experience feels good and safe. The mobile experience feels completely smooth. Everything feels under control. So I think a good final way to frame performance in 2026 is fast Elementor websites are usually not trying to do everything. They're trying to do the right things consistently and intentionally. And that restraint that we put in because of our maturity is often what makes them feel professional. So to wrap things up, some key takeaways. First, performance starts during the build. Most long-term performance maintainability problems are introduced early through layout decisions, styling decisions, widget choices, overall system complexity. Optimization later can help, but structure kind of matters first. Second, simpler structures outperform clever ones, especially in Elementor. Flatter layouts, predictable containers, cleaner systems, less nesting, they perform better, they edit more safely. Third, consistency beats flexibility. Unlimited flexibility sounds attractive during development, But too much freedom often creates inconsistency and fragility later. It can affect performance as well. Fourth, systems scale better than creativity. This doesn't mean designs become boring. It means reasonable thinking becomes more important than continually reinventing layout. So thinking about scale first. And finally, restraint is a performance strategy. Probably more than any specific optimization technique. Not every section needs animation. Not every widget needs to be interactive. Not every page needs visual intensity. Some of the fastest, most professional Elementor sites feel calm because they are intentionally restrained. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest mindset shifts in modern web design. Good performance is often the result of disciplined decisions, repeatedly, consistently over time, not magic optimization tricks at the end. Okay, that's me done. I know it's a bit of a longer session today. Thanks for bearing with me.